On this episode of China Unscripted, can Americans stop fighting amongst themselves long enough to fight China? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jung.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And joining us today is John Teichert. He's a retired U.S. Air Force brigadier general who consults on national security, international affairs, innovation, and leadership. He's the author of the new book, Boom! Leadership that Breaks Barriers, Challenges Conventions, and Ignites Innovation. And this year, he's running for U.S. Senate representing Maryland. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I am overjoyed to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
And we mentioned this before we started recording, but the Maryland flag, it's very nice.
It is. I think it's so unique, just like our awesome state of 6.2 million people.
Are you running for office?
It sounds like maybe yes.
All right. Well, I'm very excited to have you on because, you come from a military background. So that gives you a bit of a different take than your typical politician. And so currently in Washington, a lot of people see China as a strategic competitor, not an adversary. How do you feel about that coming from your military background?
I was in the building, the Pentagon, when the debates were going on in the administration about what to call China. And specifically, there was this wrestling match between calling them a pacing threat and a pacing challenge. And the Doves won out in the midst of that discussion and called them a pacing challenge. They did so, at least according to their rationale, so that they wouldn't actually create something that was a threat that otherwise wouldn't be a threat if we called them something differently. But I do think that it undersells the nature of the strategic challenge that exists with China by just calling them a pacing challenge instead of a pacing threat. It sounds like maybe we're playing a game of ping pong with them instead of this major, important geopolitical struggle that is certainly the struggle of our day.
Well, this is the thing I find strange about the China Doves. In their mind, it almost is like China has no agency of its own. They just react to whatever the U.S. does. They don't have any strategic ambitions of their own, any desires or goals.
No, I think that you're right. And I think that as you look back to 1999 and those two Chinese Communist Party colonels that crafted their strategy of unrestricted warfare, you see that they do have agency and that they do have objectives of their own. And those objectives in many ways are exactly counter to American objectives. And thus, I believe that we should see them far more than just a challenger, but as a threat because of the nature of how those objectives in unrestricted warfare have been playing out for the last 25 years. And they are showing themselves to be far more than just a competitor or a challenger. They are indeed a threat.
Well, I'm glad you brought up unconventional warfare or unrestricted warfare. As your position as an Air Force general, you probably are hyper aware of some of these tactics. Can you give us some examples? Because I think a lot of Americans, they think of war, they think of, troops on the ground, bullets flying. That's not what China's doing.
It is not.
War.
No, it is. And look back to $700 billion of American stolen intellectual property a year. That has a real impact on our country.
A year.
Or Chinese communist clubs in U.S. colleges, or Chinese police stations in major U.S. cities, or the spy balloon fiasco from a year ago, or encircling the United States with spy stations like the one that currently is stood up in Cuba. Those are examples that are far short of conventional war, but are starting to erode America's ability to allow the international order to remain that has benefited humanity since the end of World War II, that is free, open, prosperous, and secure.
I think one really good example of unrestricted warfare I found out about recently is, TikTok. Well, TikTok period is an example. But specifically, after Hamas attacked Israel, there was this surge in TikTok of, very pro-Hamas rhetoric on TikTok being pushed, well, we can assume by the Chinese Communist Party, driving a narrative to influence American youth who maybe had no knowledge of the conflict outside of what they were getting from TikTok.
You're spot on. That's a great example about how that information component of warfare that's a part of unrestricted warfare is starting to change American attitudes or perceptions that ultimately could change the strategic abilities of the United States to counter this threat from China. And certainly the Chinese Communist Party use of TikTok or other informational warfare elements is a great example of what is meant by unrestricted warfare. And it's not just against Americans, but against the West. And it's also going on there in the Western Pacific day by day also.
General, I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier about being in the Pentagon when they were debating between the idea of a pacing challenge versus a pacing threat. I find that interesting because I think when we think about China and the attitude towards the Chinese Communist Party, often we think of the State Department trying to, as diplomats, trying to really soften the U.S. approach toward the Chinese Communist Party. So it's interesting to hear you talking about this debate also taking place within the Pentagon, thinking about the Department of Defense maybe being more aware of the military implications. So I know you're retired now, but from what you can see, do you think that the Pentagon has a realistic idea of what the Chinese Communist Party is actually doing in the world?
I think they certainly have all of the information necessary to characterize the Chinese Communist Party appropriately. My concern is that the whole of government strategy driven by the national security strategy and the Biden administration is being very intentional about soft selling the real nature of the threat. Certainly, as you look at the intelligence reports, or as you consider the military instrument of power and the decisions that have to be made in shifting our focus to the Western Pacific, in this Pacific pivot that was started to talk about in 2012, I think, that we've never actually see come to fruition, we realize that the Chinese Communist Party is flexing their muscles, especially in the areas of the South China Sea and the Western Pacific, in a threatening type of way. But the concern is, as everybody has a boss, and the Secretary of Defense and the Defense Department are taking their cues from the Biden administration and President Biden himself, that he is being extremely careful to soft sell the nature of the threat, when the reality is that we can't properly prepare for the threat or deter the threat unless we understand the realistic nature of what the threat is all about.
Right. So a lot of people then in the administration are concerned about angering China. And you see this headline in the media as well, such and such angers China. Is that a concern? Or if we soften our approach, will that change China's behavior? Or is standing up to them going to cause them to invade Taiwan, for example?
My characterization of the Biden administration for the last 3 years is that every decision they make against a major competitor is shaped by this desire about concern of escalation. You see it in the Middle East and with Iran. You see it with Putin and in Eastern Europe. And you certainly see it in the Western Pacific. And it's as if President Biden himself, the only real strategic consideration he makes in a lot of these decisions is this overwhelming concern about escalation. We even saw it this morning as we woke up to hear about how the Biden administration finally, after 2 months, struck back against the Houthis. But now there's this massive concern that maybe things will escalate as a result. The problem is, as I've seen in Iraq firsthand, or I've seen leading international affairs for the Air Force and the Space Force firsthand, is that these malign elements in the international sphere actually feed off of American weakness. And the more concerned we are about escalation, the more likely it is that escalation will occur, because those malign elements, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, don't believe that the United States will actually do anything to stop them.
It's interesting you're talking about that, because I've been listening to this podcast called the Fall of Civilizations podcast. And there's a story about Rome approaching Carthage and threatening them with war. And Rome was like, okay, if you just give us all of your weapons, that'll de-escalate the thing. And they do. Considering this is called the Fall of Civilizations podcast, how do you think that turned out for Carthage?
No, I think you're spot on. I think as you look very realistically at what China's aims are not just in the Western Pacific, but around the world, or Iran's or Russia's or North Korea's, you see that they actually respect strength, capability, will, and resolve. And those elements will check their behavior. And if they see an absence of those elements, then it only entices them to do more and more malign activity on the world stage.
So you're not concerned about angering China?
Well, I think that we should consider angering China, but I am here ultimately, or certainly was when I served in the United States Air Force, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. But I also realize that China every single day is considering whether they're going to make a move in the Western Pacific that would be massively counter to our interests. And they're considering our deterrent posture. And the less capability we have, the more likely it is that they'll make a move. And the less will we show, the more likely it is that they'll make a move. It's not as if we're going to do something so provocative that it forces them to make a move in the Western Pacific. Just the opposite. The less will we demonstrate, the more likely it is that they'll do something that is massively counter to our interests. And we've seen that as we've tried to placate them during the last 3 years, or maybe since Unrestricted Warfare was published in 1999. And again, they respect strength, capability, will, and resolve, and they will take advantage of the lack.
So what do you think the U.S. response should be? And so I'll give an example with the South China Sea. China uses short of war tactics, or salami slicing as it gets called. They build these artificial islands in the South China Sea to claim territory. The U.S. says, don't do that. They do that. And then the U.S. says, okay, just don't militarize them. China says they won't, and they do. What should the U.S. response be? Because obviously, with these short of war tactics, it's not like a missile strike on Beijing is the response to them building artificial islands.
So let me start talking about what our strategy is, or maybe should be, which is the necessary components of deterrence. And deterrence, as your listeners undoubtedly know, was a Cold War term that was very successful in stopping us from seeing a hot war against the Soviet Union. And now our official strategy in the United States is something that uses deterrence called integrated deterrence. And the only real difference from Cold War deterrence is that integrated means that we're looking across the American instruments of power, diplomatic, intelligence or informational, military, and economic, and maybe whole of society deterrence in order to stop China from doing those things that we do not want them to do. And ultimately, the way deterrence works is that you demonstrate capability and will, and it changes the perceptions of the balance of cost, risk, and reward for that country that you're trying to deter. And so our official strategy, at least according to the National Defense Strategy, is this thing called integrated deterrence. The problem is that when the National Security Strategy was published after the National Defense Strategy, it didn't really mention integrated deterrence at all, other than in the military instrument of power component of the National Security Strategy. And you can't be integrated in your ability to deter if you're not using elements of power apart from the military instrument of power. And my ultimate concern in the Biden administration is that, one, while we've got the capability, we're not demonstrating the will in using that capability. And we're only saying integrated deterrence when the reality is that the military is thinking about deterrence posture in an integrated way. The other instruments of power aren't being integrated or used in a way that will check China's ambitions in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific and beyond. So the first step is demonstrating will and capability, not just in the South China Sea, but all around the world, and actually implementing an integrated deterrent posture that's far more than just the military or the defense component of deterrence.
Can you give an example of what that might look like if it was integrated across different things, not just the military?
So part of it goes to our military posture, but also our whole of government posture as we allocate resources in diplomacy and intelligence and military and the economy, so that we are focusing on this shift to the Pacific instead of what we have done for the last 25 years or so, which is a focus on other areas of the world. And so to me, really integrating with the economic instrument of power as an example to make sure that as we consider the balance of our capability in the economic sphere such that it integrates not just with a focus on the Western Pacific, but it also integrates with our allies and partners in the Western Pacific. We've got these amazing treaty allies in South Korea, in Japan, in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Australia. And instead of just doing some military exercises and work in our posture with them, how are we actively integrating our diplomatic capability so that we are on one page with those allies and partners in the Western Pacific and, by the way, around the world as well, or economically or informationally as well? And I just fear that while we do some shifting of military capabilities to focus on the Western Pacific, if we're not actually working with those same treaty allies in a robust way in diplomacy and information and the economy, then we're leaving a lot on the table that lessens our ability to deter China from doing the things we do not want them to do.
Okay, so for a specific example, as Chris mentioned, China said, Xi Jinping promised in 2015 that China would not militarize the islands in the South China Sea. It was clear within 2 to 3 years that those islands were being militarized. It was a slow process. It was not announced anywhere, right? So what's a specific thing that's short of war on America's end that the U.S. could have done, whether it's military or diplomatic, to actually be like a what do you call it, like a measured response to that aggressive building of military hardware?
Yeah, I think in that case, that shadowing or mirroring that type of action by China would get their attention. Let's militarize an unknown area within that realm, within the Western Pacific, or maybe even the South China Sea, and do the same things alongside of our allies and partners that are the things that have caused us such concern that the Chinese have done since 2015 or even before then. And so I think that's a great example where now we leverage the economies and the diplomacy and the information and the military realms to actually do some of the same types of things which would check them in their considerations about what they would do. And it would also further exacerbate some of the strategic challenges that they would have to consider as they consider whether they're going to make a move against Taiwan.
Okay, so for example, the Philippines, they have that rusty old ship on, it's the second Thomas Shoal, right? And they're using that as kind of like a sort of bulwark against China's military and territorial claims there. Like, should the U.S. work with the Philippines maybe to transform that shoal into a militarized island with a runway, the same kind of thing we're seeing in Fiery Cross Reef?
No, so I think that's exactly what we could do. Now, maybe not specifically there because there is so much attention on that right now, but maybe in some other area within the archipelago of the Philippines that we start creating real capability. I do have to give the Biden administration credit for some of the additional enhanced use sites that we have at least talked about standing up within the Philippines. But I actually think creating something out of nothing in an island somewhere within the Philippines or South Korea or Japan, and actually creating this multi-use capability that could be militarized or seen as militarized is something that would give China pause about their continued expansion in that area as well.
This is an interesting idea because, number one, you're talking about the U.S. needing to work with its allies, specifically in the Pacific, Indo-Pacific. But it's also a way that the military can get involved in countering China's aggression that doesn't rise to the level of actual combat. This isn't just U.S. and its allies working economically against China, but the U.S. and its allies working militarily against China.
So I think that you could actually consider that type of activity not just a military activity, but you could also see that it would take diplomatic unity in order to do something like that, that it would maybe create a post for intelligence activity, especially there closer to the specific proximate region of concern. And then you could even see it as an economic hub as well. And I think the benefit of thinking about things in an integrated fashion or via integrated deterrence actually makes that one activity far more than just a military activity, though I think it would be a poignant military activity. But I think that you could see it as an activity that would span the instruments of power and would certainly get the Chinese Communist Party's attention.
Now, since we're talking about roles the U.S. military can play in countering China, obviously the big question in the Pacific is Taiwan. As we're recording this, Taiwan is holding their major election, and China has said it's the choice is between peace and war. What can the U.S. military do to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Let me go back to actually how it's not just what happens in the Western Pacific that creates a deterrent posture from the United States and our allies and partners, but how the United States responds around the world. There are some specific things we can do in the Western Pacific, and I will address those here in a moment. But China isn't just looking in their immediate area to see if the United States has capability, will, strength, and resolve. They're looking around the world. And how we respond in the Middle East gets China's attention for good or bad. How we respond in Eastern Europe gets China's attention for good or bad. How we respond to other possible threats or uprisings, say within South America or Africa, gets China's attention for good or bad. And so one of the ways that we need to think about integrated deterrence is via integrated, meaning not just using all of the elements of power, but also using what goes on in one geographic area to help not just that region, but also to suffice for our enhanced integrated posture in other areas of the world. And I am concerned, ultimately, that as we demonstrate a lack of will or resolve in areas like the Red Sea, though I'm glad that we did what we did last night against the Houthis, but that was 2 months too late, that when we show weakness or a lack of will and resolve, then it actually increases the likelihood that China is going to make a move because they don't believe that the United States has credibility, and that makes things in the Western Pacific more dangerous. Now, when it comes to the Taiwanese elections and what's going to take place tomorrow, Taiwan time, is that ultimately we need to help Taiwan, alongside of our allies and partners, create a posture that makes it far more difficult for China to conceptualize that they could succeed in their malign aims against Taiwan. One of the unique American advantages that the United States has, it says so in the national security strategy, is this broad network of allies and partners. Certainly unique means that China wishes they had it, but that they don't. And something that the United States has done extremely well in cultivating since World War II, probably before World War II, is creating this broad, trusting network of allies and partners that China now has to consider as they make a move against Taiwan as a part of the response, not just from Taiwan, but from this consolidated network of allies and partners that the United States has and can possibly mobilize alongside of Taiwan. There are some operational to strategic things that we can do to harden Taiwan, to make it more difficult for China to conceptualize that they could succeed. And I think that several studies have indicated that right now there is reason for Chinese Communist Party officials to doubt that they could succeed. But specifically, we, the United States, alongside of our allies and partners, need to consider this as a global challenge or a global opportunity instead of specifically what we're doing proximately to Taiwan.
So you're saying that the Chinese Communist Party is watching U.S., for good or bad, and what we do in the rest of the world, the Middle East and Ukraine. And I want to ask about Ukraine in particular because there's a lot of there's a split among Republicans in particular about whether it's a waste of money and resources to support Ukraine versus it being valuable to support Ukraine for other strategic reasons. So how do you see this?
And so I think Ukraine actually can be traced back to American weakness in our feckless pullout of Afghanistan. And that's just a great example of how one region of the world can be impacted by another region of the world. Right now, America has spent about $110 billion in support to Ukraine, Europe has spent about double that. But it is the case that China is watching how the United States and her allies and partners handle things in Ukraine. And that factors heavily into the decision about what they'll do in the Western Pacific. It is right, however, for those in the American security establishment to consider how are we balancing the resources that we have so that we can have the right capability in the right place that ultimately can be used to respond in a case of aggression from China against Taiwan or China's aggression elsewhere. And so we, the United States, especially now that there's this additional conflict in the Middle East that didn't exist when the war in Ukraine started 23 months ago, we need to make sure that we are properly holding Ukraine accountable for transparency in how they're using resources. And then whether we see an actual theory of victory or strategy that can allow them to achieve their objectives, Ukraine, and America to succeed in our objectives through Ukraine in doing so. But I do firmly believe that in this balance of deterrence, which includes capability and will, that while Ukraine takes some actual capability away from our ability to deploy that capability in the Western Pacific, our continued support, measured, sustainable support of Ukraine demonstrates a level of will, which is actually the only thing that China actually is concerned about with respect to the United States and her allies and partners. And the more that we shore up our credibility and our will in various elements or areas of the world, the more likely it is that China will get the message that our will is strong and they don't want to make a move because America will engage if they do.
President Biden has said, I think on at least 3 occasions, when asked by reporters, that the U.S. military will defend Taiwan. And that is a demonstration of will, or at least a position. Is that will? What else should the U.S. administration or Congress do specifically to deter Taiwan when it comes to actually working with Taiwan?
It goes back a little bit to our initial part of our conversation, which is that we need to be very clear that we will stand up to those things that we see China doing that we do not see in our interests. And when we say we don't want to do something because it could anger China or the Chinese Communist Party, it just demonstrates a lack of will or resolve that actually makes things more dangerous. Specifically, though, when it comes to military capability in or around Taiwan or in the Western Pacific, that we have an extremely broad portfolio of challenges as the United States. We have been the ones that have maintained a free, open, prosperous, and secure world order since the end of World War II. But as we balance our limited capabilities, as limited as we are, though we are extremely expansive, that we need to make sure that we are shifting the right capabilities to the right positions around the world, but specifically in the Western Pacific, so that it is clear that the United States is postured to be able to support Taiwan and to engage if there is an actual conflict there alongside of our allies and partners. But specifically, we also need to encourage Taiwan to make wise allocations of their own resources. And one of the things that I see as I ran international affairs and security cooperation for the Air Force and the Space Force is that a lot of countries want prestige systems because it is comforting to them to have things like highly advanced F-16s on the ramps of their airfields in their country. But those may not be the actual capabilities that would allow them to succeed in a conflict. And those capabilities may not be the ones that deter in conflict. And so working very closely alongside of our Taiwanese partners and using our allies and partners to do so as well, we need to make sure that they are balanced properly so that China firmly believes that it would be extremely difficult for them to attack and subjugate Taiwan. I know, just based on what China has considered in the last 20 years, that right now their biggest possible concern is that they are an untested military, and an amphibious or airborne assault of a country 80 miles away or a region 80 miles away would be extremely difficult. And right now, the more that we can help Taiwan invest in ways that further create doubt in the minds of the Chinese Communist Party, the better it is, because the deterrent posture is stronger.
I want to go back to something that you said a little bit earlier about how the pullout of Afghanistan affected the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How do you see balancing? I think because the U.S. has been involved in the Middle East for so long now, there's been a lot of domestic fatigue among the public for what some people call like endless wars. And, I think politicians on both sides of the aisle have said, okay, we need to not be as involved in some of these like military things in other countries. How do you balance that, as a politician with, feeling like there is the need for the U.S. to maintain that deterrent posture in the Pacific or in other parts of the world?
So we are limited in our resources. We don't have endless resources. And you're right. We need to make very careful decisions about how we allocate our resources. And that means where are the pieces of equipment that matter? Where are our people? And how are they properly distributed? One quick thought on Afghanistan. At the moment we pulled out of Afghanistan in August and September of 2021, we only had about 2,500 Americans there, 2,500 Americans. When I ran Joint Base Andrews, we had 17,000 people come to work there every single day. That means that the total American force posture in Afghanistan was about a seventh the amount of people that come to an average base on an average day in the United States. That is an extremely small footprint. Those 2,500 Americans were not getting killed. They were not getting injured. They were enduring deployments away from their family, but that is a minute footprint to maintain the status quo in a place like Afghanistan and to maintain American credibility there. Right now in Iraq, there's about the same number of people, 2,500. In Syria, there's about 800 Americans. Those are extremely small footprints that allow us to maintain a status quo and maintain our objectives and credibility in doing so. We, of course, going back to the beginning, have to carefully allocate those resources, but we also have to have a sense of proportionality that we are an extremely large and capable force. We still have a large footprint in South Korea in a war that now is 70 years old. And we are rightfully postured there in order to maintain a status quo that is beneficial to that country, but more importantly to the United States. And so we do need to make tough decisions about what we are doing and more importantly, what we are not doing. But we also have to have a sense of proportionality. And while something may sound good about endless wars, we've got to be very careful to throw those terms around, because once we erode our credibility, it means that others who are watching are more likely to make moves that truly harm our strategic interests.
So what do you think is the kind of answer here? Do you think it's like better messaging to the American public? Like, what do you think would help like balance that sense of proportionality that you're talking about?
I think a part of it is that we need real strategic leaders in various elements of government instead of just politicians. And I am running for United States Senate out of Maryland. I don't need to talk too much about that here, but my motto is leadership, not politics. And we have a lot of politicians doing political things, and frankly, a lot of them lack a strategic clarity about the importance of things that go on around the world. And a big part of that is that we need the right leaders in the right positions that have strategic clarity and that can message strategic clarity. And going back to that talk about proportionality in the pullout of Afghanistan, it is extremely important for us as American leaders to help the American public to understand why we're doing things in the world that are of benefit to America and how it benefits America. The Red Sea and the Houthis are a great example of that. 12% of international commerce go through the Red Sea. And just in the last month, because of Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, the cost of a container transported from Asia to the eastern United States has gone up 50%. That same container from Asia to Northern Europe has gone up by 200%. Those are real impacts on Americans and Europeans based on America losing control of one area of the world, the Red Sea, against a very low-level force in the Houthis. We need to help Americans understand very clearly that it matters to them what goes on in the Middle East. It matters to them what goes on in Eastern Europe. And it certainly matters to them what goes on in the Western Pacific. And if we don't have leaders that have strategic clarity and the ability to communicate that, then it's easy for the American public to not understand what goes on in those areas of the world because their leaders aren't helping them to understand.
Since you mentioned that you're running for Senate, I think often when we think about U.S. foreign policy, we think of it as a like an executive, thing, right? Like the president really leads on foreign policy. What do you think is the role of the Senate when it comes to foreign policy, and especially when it comes to like the U.S. relationship with China?
The United States Senate has an extremely important constitutional role in foreign policy, specifically related to treaties, but also in holding the executive branch to account for what they are doing. And as the upper chamber, it is the responsibility of every single United States senator to be an expert in national security, foreign policy, and international affairs issues. And sadly, we do not see that in a lot of cases in the United States Senate. And as a result, a lot of the United States Senate over the course of recent history has abdicated some of their constitutional responsibility to the executive branch instead of making sure that the executive branch is checked in the right way through the advice and the consent of the United States Senate. And that is the responsibility of the US Senate to wrestle back some of that responsibility, but also the American public to make sure that we are electing people that have the strategic vision and understanding of foreign affairs so that they can fulfill those constitutional responsibilities from their position in the United States Senate.
So your new book has come out, and one of the things you talk about is leadership that challenges convention. What does that mean, and what does that mean specifically with respect to how we can deal with China?
Thanks for asking. Specifically, the book is entitled Boom, and that is the idea that we need to break apart some of the convention, and we need to ignite innovation. We need to break down barriers. And in my mind, every single area of our society needs leaders that are willing to do some igniting of innovation and breaking down barriers and challenging conventions. Specifically with regard to China, I think that it's very easy within the American national security establishment to do the next thing that is very close to the thing that we had done before. And instead of taking a fresh look at what are we actually doing, then we're just adding on to the status quo. I mentioned earlier F-16s in a place like Taiwan. I'm not saying that Taiwan doesn't need American air power assistance as a part of their strategic capabilities, but are we actually providing them either through American foreign military financing or through foreign military sales the right mix of capabilities that they need that actually isn't just a portfolio that is based on the inertia of the past, but is based on a fresh look at the real strategic challenges in that area. And to me, leaders are very comfortable just being an extension of the status quo. To me, that's not leadership. That's management at best. Leaders actually take a look at real problems and find real solutions that are partly informed by the status quo, but are also absolutely tied to the real objectives and the real requirements instead of just an extension that is a boring passing on of the buck from the predecessor to the successor.
Yeah, but there's going to be a lot of pushback to anyone who tries to exert a leadership role by challenging convention.
No, you're right. And I think that a leader shouldn't take a leadership position if they're not willing to take pushback. Here's what I found, certainly as a leader commanding Edwards Air Force Base or Joint Base Andrews, or being the senior defense official to Iraq, that you've got an incredible team underneath you. And if you can start soliciting by listening to them and considering their ideas, then ultimately you can act upon some of those ideas and you can be better informed to explain yourself up the chain so that your bosses or the American public better understand that it is in their best interest to do something different instead of just be an extension of the status quo. And every single time that I have seen my team unleashed in solving a problem, they also have helped me create a communications plan that has made it something that is not just palatable, but something that is eagerly embraced by my chain of command above me. And I acknowledge that there is always pushback from a frozen middle or from below or from above. But when you start creating an environment within your team, including in the national security realm, where you are soliciting ideas that you would have never thought about, then now you're able to take action in a way that isn't just wedded to the status quo, but is actually wedded to the power of the minds within your organization that have created something new and have found a way to communicate it in a way that is palatable and eagerly accepted by those around you.
That sounds like a very different reality to the U.S. military than is usually portrayed in Hollywood films, where it's the leader, the general, is like a petty tyrant who doesn't listen to anyone.
You're right. I think that sometimes by watching Hollywood or actually seeing really bad examples of leadership, we think that an organization is a leader that makes all the decisions and all of the people in the organization that just carry out orders blindly without thought. Sometimes that exists, and you see ineffective organizations or an ineffective national security establishment as a result. But when you find ways to break down barriers by eliciting feedback and listening to people all around you, then now it's just a leader with a bunch of dumb, mindless followers, but it is an organization that solicits ideas that can be culled through by the leadership team to ultimately be able to make the best decisions, not just for your organization, but in a national security establishment context for the betterment of the nation and support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
One of the things that we want to talk about in this podcast is the upcoming election. I mean, obviously we've talked about that you're running for Senate, but election interference from foreign adversaries is a real issue. And it was certainly an issue in 2020 that we all remember, accusations of foreign interference. It also came up in 2016, but from the opposite side of the aisle, saying that there was election interference and that's why Trump won, right? So is this a real threat? And how do you see this, if so, potentially playing out in the 2024 elections?
It goes back to that 1999 strategy of unrestricted warfare. Part of unrestricted warfare is changing the mindset of a population, the United States or Western Europe or whoever it may be. And going back to that TikTok example that we described earlier with respect to support for Hamas, that TikTok or other informational avenues are already swaying the minds of the American public, specifically those that have TikTok and the younger population that lives on TikTok. But it's also the case that there are other nefarious ways that an adversary, Russia or China primarily, can adjust the mindset sufficiently of a country or a population such that now they are able to sway the results of an election. We talked about Taiwan and the election that is taking place as we film this tomorrow within Taiwan. That certainly China, the Chinese Communist Party specifically, has been finding ways to dissuade the Taiwanese people from voting for a hardliner that would take a stand that maybe would shift Taiwan's focus towards more of an independent focus. And we see within the United States that China is already influencing our minds via Chinese communist clubs and colleges or via TikTok. And certainly there is a more advanced strategy within China or from China and from or within Russia as well that is doing their best to achieve their strategic aims by adjusting the mindset of the American populace so that China can achieve their objectives with minimal interference from the United States.
And what do you think that China's objective is specifically with regards to this upcoming election?
Ultimately, if you go back to the four primary goals of the Chinese Communist Party in order, number one is to maintain power within China. Number two is to return Taiwan back to China. Number three is to give themselves regional dominance, and number 4 is to give themselves global dominance. And a more docile United States, one that is either distracted by dysfunction and infighting, or a United States that is strongly dovish in the sense that China can achieve those objectives without American interference, either capability or will. Those are the types of things that China and Russia are actively pursuing against the United States. And probably the one that they are pursuing the most is sowing seeds of dysfunction and divisiveness within the United States, regardless of who wins. And the concern of the United States should be that our greatest threat isn't China, but our greatest threat is a dysfunction within our political system that makes us incapable of responding to a variety of the challenges that we face internationally and domestically from the United States.
And what do you think is the solution for that?
The solution ultimately is for us as Americans to get back to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and demanding that our leaders do the same. When I was the senior defense official in Iraq, one of my roles was to represent the United States military to the senior leaders of Iraq. And one of the guys that I met with weekly was a general named Abdul Amir Urala, their chief of defense, their CHOD, their chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an Iranian-aligned guy that hated Americans and probably hated me. But where we found ourselves to have productive professional weekly meetings was by looking at his objectives and looking at our objectives, both his personal objectives and his nation's objectives and our nation's objectives. And instead of lingering on those areas where we were different, cultivate the fertile ground where we overlapped. And in the United States, in the Senate or in the House or the executive or the judicial or the legislative branch, there is plenty of room around support and defend the Constitution of the United States, where we should recognize that we have real problems in this country that require real solutions. And that means working with a variety of people that have also taken that oath. And instead of shouting at each other about our differences, we need to realize that we can't solve the real problems that exist by shouting at one another. We need to find those areas where we overlap and find solutions within those areas, both domestically and internationally.
That's pretty interesting. Getting into a shouting match with an Iranian general would really be unproductive. So you'd think maybe Congress can, like fellow Americans, would be able to not resort to that.
It blows me away. It truly blows me away that with Abdul Amir Urala, this Iraqi general but Iranian aligned, we had these rich hour-long weekly meetings that were massively productive. If I could do that with Abdul Amir Urala, how can Republicans and Democrats who swore the same oath to support and defend not do that far more productively with one another?
Well, because the one side is reptiles.
Well, which side you're not going to say.
I'm not gonna say.
I mean, but you were right in the sense that, like, it seems that I don't know if I want to say conventional wisdom, but the idea now is that to win elections, you have to demonize the other side, and rally your team and your base. And if you're seen to work with the enemy, that is like a death blow. You're never going to get elected.
And we're never going to get anything done either. And you're right. There are these series of perverse incentives within our federal political system where people benefit electorally and with power or attention or fundraising because they say the most radical, flamboyant things and they demonize the other side. I want your listeners to check me on that. TeichertForMaryland.com is my website, and you will never see that from me. I am here to solve real problems with real solutions. That means working with a variety of people. I don't know if I'm going to be able to win performing that strategy or not, but it is the best thing for our country to have leaders step into the political realm and be willing to take the risk, one, to run, but two, to do so in the right way so that we can finally get back to solving problems instead of yelling at one another.
Or you could come up with clever nicknames to call your opponents.
Yeah, that does work. I'd rather use nicknames to rally people and inspire people around the things we can do together instead of just vilifying others.
Yeah, Friendly Joe. Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on the podcast. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
I enjoyed myself. You guys had a great podcast and a great interview. I would encourage your listeners to check out my book, Boom, and to check me out at TeichertForMaryland.com. And I appreciate every minute that we spent together.
Absolutely. He said a lot of really inspiring things, like, obviously I'm that perfect model of leadership for you guys. I'm always open to listening to your suggestions. You admire me tremendously.
Did he say that something about admiring the leader tremendously? I don't remember that part.
I'm pretty sure he did.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you do.
And the way you crush your opponents, like me.
That's true.
It really works.
Who is on my team must struggle resolutely against your own team.
Well, I mean, I guess in a way that is like the exact opposite leadership strategy of the Chinese Communist
That's
Party.
right.
Now that you make that joke,
That's right. You see, my jokes have a purpose. Purpose.
Unlike my jokes.
But yeah, I mean that is that is the thing about the communist system is it's weird because it's not like a dictatorship in the conventional sense where it empowers a single individual. It's this system that perpetuates the system itself at the expense of chewing through human lives, including people in the party.
Well, I mean, sometimes it does empower an individual, like Mao.
Mao, yeah. Well, I mean, he was, I think, the best communist.
Right. But also consider the immense power struggles that Mao had to deal with. Like the entire decade of Cultural Revolution, which was horrible for the entire country, was basically Mao starting to get purged and then using his sort of cult of personality as a way to maintain power when he otherwise would have been purged.
Yeah, because of the failures of the Great Leap Forward.
Yeah. So, yeah, not a great system. I mean, I think that there's always, in any country's leadership, there's going to be some kind of disagreement about how to do certain things. But I would say that because the U.S. has more of a rules-based system for who gets elected, not perfect, but it's basically a rules-based system. Whereas in communist China, it's a no rules mafia, free for all, essentially.
I mean, there are rules, but you can have somebody come in and remake the rules, like Xi Jinping, right?
Right. So if a leader can arbitrarily remake the rules, then what are those rules? Whereas in the U.S., if you want to change the Constitution, it's extremely difficult, and there's only been, a couple dozen amendments in, 250 years.
There you go, running your mouth, sleepy Matt.
How long were you thinking about that while he was talking?
Matt Sanctimonious. I'm not good at this. This is why I'm not running for president.
Okay, wonderful Chris.
I love you. The country will be great when I take over.
A supreme leader.
Mm-hmm. For life. The last vote you'll ever need and you'll ever get. Yeah, I wish we could talk about the Taiwan election, but that's happening tomorrow.
And it will have already happened by the time everybody's watching this.
Yes.
So,
but if you're watching this now, we will have something coming out about the election on the next podcast. So stay tuned.
Yeah, we'll have a week to settle the fallout of whatever happens.
I really hope a week from now it's not like, oh my God, they actually did invade. I really don't think they will.
I don't think they're gonna. I read a Substack today where the person was like, yeah, no, they'll invade in the spring. And I was like, oh, good.
No,
that's because of the Blackwater guy said so.
Well, lots of people have said 2024, and I think it's ridiculous myself. However, I will just give one little interesting factoid because I have some friends who are in Taiwan. Actually, the Anderson, our video editor, is in Taiwan. And so China launched a satellite last week before the election. And so Taiwan sent out a presidential alert to everyone in the island about it, and they translated it into English as missile fly over Taiwan airspace. Be aware.
Yeah, that got really contentious because then you had different political sides accusing other political sides of trying to drum up scare tactics ahead of the election by calling it a missile. Whereas probably it was just some person who did not do a good job translating and then accidentally caused an entire political incident.
Or the reptiles control everything. That one didn't land. I don't know why.
I don't know, Chris, because maybe it seems like people might take that seriously.
That's true. The internet does take things seriously about Reptiles.
And
being
now
controlled.
this entire podcast is going to get erased from YouTube.
Oh no! Oh, by the way, I need to say this. You mentioned about possible foreign interference in the election. The 2020 election was the most secure election in the history of the world. It was perfect. It was the best. Don't delete this, YouTube, please. Please.
I really want to end this on another note.
Okay.
Well, so I will say one thing about
Another note. Nice.
I'll say one thing about the Taiwan elections, which, we don't know the result of it as of this recording, but you will know it while watching it, which is that there's a debate politically in Taiwan about whether to stand up to the CCP or to try to work with them.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, and General Teichert was talking about this, right? Like, it's if you demonstrate will and resolve to stand up to a threat, then you are actually less likely to be hurt or invaded, not more likely.
Another brilliant speech from glorious Matt.
Thank you, wonderful Chris.
Thoughts, Shelley.
Smart Shelley. Sarcastic Shelley.
Wait, hold on. Is that a compliment?
It is coming from me.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. I appreciate your wit, Shelley, and your
Thank
cutting
you for watching
sarcasm
China
as it comes to
Unscripted.
me.
I'm Chris Chappell.
We have to stop before it gets too nice.
Yeah. I'm getting uncomfortable dealing with emotions.
We will not. Okay, our next show, Emotions Unexpressed.
No more new shows.
That's actually a British show.
Emotions Unexpressed.
Yeah. All right. Well.
I'm Shelley Zhang. Is that where we're going?
Yes, and I'm Matt Gnezda.
And I'm Wonderful Chris. I'm going to go back to that. Thank you for watching.
I think this is the first time we've gone off the rails during the outro. Like during the actual part where you just say, I'm Chris Chappell.
An outro is just the